Hello, everyone. Welcome to this very special conversation I'm having with Lilith of Bloodborne Demake fame, and it used to be Bloodborne Kart before the scoundrels over at Sony came a knocking. Lilith, how you doing?
Hi, doing great. How are you?
I'm doing really good now. This has been a long time coming. I think I reached out to you like half a year ago or something. My backlog is terrible.
That sounds about right. Yeah, it was forever ago.
And, but yeah, because I had followed the Bloodborne Demake development a little bit. I don't know if you put out a lot of devlogs, but I definitely recall seeing it like in the periphery before it came out, at least for a little bit.
Yeah, I made development threads, just like here's what I worked on today. Here's what I did. Here's what I want to do. I was definitely very public about its development. Putting out daily threads before the release.
Yeah, I looked at this, and there's a lot of fan projects like these that not necessarily bad. I love fan projects, but usually I don't think that and this is a great compliment I'm going to give you. I feel like you really managed to elevate Bloodborne with this presentation style.
Thank you.
I'm particularly, we can go into that once I start asking you some questions, but I'm particularly a fan of the sort of extended platforming sequences that you added. There's a few there.
Yeah, a little bit.
It's because it works so great with the DualShock controller of the PlayStation 1.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, glad you enjoyed those.
I'm a big fan. I love those levels where we're just falling down precariously placed beams. Do you remember when you integrated controller inputs for the game?
That was the very first thing I did.
Okay, so you weren't like dev testing it with a mouse and with a keyboard.
Oh, no. Yeah, it was because the entire game was built around the DualShock. Not the DualShock, the pre-DualShock, no right. Joysticks, PS1 controller, and everything had to expand off of that. Because Bloodborne had a lot of functions on the D-pad, and I had to make D-pad movement, which means I had to remove some gameplay functions that were tied to the PlayStation 4 gamepad, and there's no right stick, so looking left and right was tied to L2 and R2, and that meant no gun and no heavy attack, so I really had to
be creative with your
redesign everything, to make it work.
To make it fit on the more limited real estate.
Mm-hmm.
What are some changes to the presentation of the game you needed to make? Obviously there's the control layout, but for example, interface and enemy AI and such that you felt you needed to make for the PlayStation 1 conversion to feel authentic.
Right. The biggest thing for the UI was the big spinning 3D objects for all the items. That was a really big part of PlayStation 1 and 64. Just early... Mm-hmm. First gen 3D games, they loved shoving 3D objects in your face just to, show off that everything was in 3D. Yep. And I loved setting that whole system up, the whole radial 3D objects, and look at this key, and look at this weapon, and look at this, this blood vial, and it's spinning in your face. And so many games nowadays don't really, now that the 3D has worn off, the 3D... the novelty of it, we kind of switched back to using thumbnails, and that, kind of loses a bit of the charm. So I wanted to bring that early 3D UI back.
It definitely feels very sort of, oh, look what we can do now.
Yeah, exactly.
Exactly. How? What's the engine the game runs on?
The game runs on Unreal Engine 4.
I've never coded for Unreal. Do you have like different layers that you can sort of overlay the HUD on, or is are these UI items being drawn on like the same layer that the rest of the game is being drawn on?
It's drawn on the same layer. It's because how Unreal Engine works is how usually the user interface works is that it draws it on the screen after the graphics have been rendered. Which effectively meant all of the PS1 post-processing effects that I put on the graphics to make it look like a PS1 game didn't apply to the UI. So I had to spawn the UI assets in the world, super tiny, and make it render over all other objects, right? And then park that in front of the camera. It was super janky, but it felt in the spirit of the PS1 if we're talking about super janky solutions. So
yeah, like I love because I also got a big feel of I got a big sort of Armored Core vibe when I first played it. I think the loading screen is just ripped directly from Armored Core 1, if I'm correct.
Yes. Armored Core was a big inspiration. I just looked at early FromSoft games, and I obviously grew up with, well, maybe not obviously, but I grew up with Armored Core and early FromSoft. And
that's awesome. So you were involved with this, like way before Demon Souls and Miyazaki came.
Oh, yeah. I'm one of those like people who liked FromSoft before they were cool. If you let's put that down in your notes. I liked FromSoft before it was cool.
I need to.
Yeah, I grew up with. I think my first FromSoft game was Armored Core 2.
Okay.
And then I played, because I was in the game store and I saw a giant robot and I was like, oh hell yeah! And I bought it, played it, it was awesome. And then I bought all the other Armored Core games, and there was like 6 at that point, and I bought all of them. And I bought Armored Core 1, and actually I never got Project Phantasma, but I got Armored Core 1, and I popped that in my PS2 and I played it, and it was awesome. And those are very formative games for me, probably alongside, like I played that a little bit after like Ocarina of Time, and I'd put it up there. Put it up there in terms of like games that were very formative for me was Armored Core, and that obviously made its way into Bloodborne PSX.
I love that you went. There was like 6 of them out by then, and I bought them all. And little did you know that there were so many more on their way.
I bought them when they came out. This is before. It wasn't before the internet, but it was before I was, this was before I looked at gaming news and stuff. So I just walked into the game store and I was like, are there any new Armored Core games? And, they would give them to me and I would play them.
I know a lot of people on my videos on Armored Core, they comment that they got into Armored Core because of demo discs. Is that how you were introduced to those games, or?
I was not. I know. Yeah, I definitely heard that sentiment. It was on one of the big demo discs, Armored Core 1, I believe. But no, I just stumbled into Armored Core organically. The box art got me.
All right. I remember when the game had first come out. This is the Demake. I saw a lot of people talking about how they would have wanted to play it with fixed camera angles. And I feel like what you did was much more faithful to the way From made games back then.
Yes.
So would you like to maybe tell these people off once and... No. I'm just wondering, did you ever think about implementing any of those sorts of changes?
I didn't. FromSoftware... FromSoftware has made a lot of games, but as far as I know, FromSoftware, at least in the PS1 era, did not... ever? Maybe, okay, I'm not gonna say not ever, but of all the games I checked out that I know of for PS1 FromSoft games, they did not do fixed camera, pre-rendered backgrounds. It was always full 3D. They were always, wow, look at us, we're in full 3D. That was the whole thing, that was the whole appeal. So that felt more appropriate than fixed camera. And I know a lot of people, when they think of PS1, they think of fixed camera, and that just depends on the games you played on the PS1, right? I grew up with Armored Core, and like Metal Gear Solid, which are both very much like we are all rendered in 3D. There's no pre-rendered anything. Yeah. I know a lot of people grew up with, Resident Evil and those kind of games with pre-rendered backgrounds. So it makes sense that there's like a split in the nostalgia when it comes to PS1. Some people think of full 3D, some people think of pre-rendered. But I thought about it, and I decided that full 3D would have been the best approach for Bloodborne PSX.
It definitely feels more authentic to the way, if the idea is, well, what if Bloodborne had come on the PlayStation 1? It this is a much more authentic way, I think, of producing that.
I agree.
Yeah. So, okay, authenticity, that's pretty important to you. I'm wondering then if there was any specific component of Bloodborne you felt you couldn't authentically reproduce in the PlayStation 1 style.
Yes. This gets into the topic of... excuse me. This gets into the topic of Bloodborne was very, very streamlined. It was very much like the fourth Souls game. I don't know the exact number, but it was very much the Souls game, a Souls-like game that was very far in. And they made a lot of quality of life improvements, and it was very streamlined, and I wanted to get rid of a lot of that. Maybe not get rid of, but like take a few steps back. Because the biggest example would be the weapon transformations. That felt very PlayStation 4.
Yeah.
Like any previous generation, maybe technically, mechanically they could do that, but like in terms of just design sensibilities of the era, we just weren't there yet. Yeah. Right? So I specifically very intentionally made weapon switching something you had to do in the menu, and it was super clunky and it was very awkward, and that made it feel more PS1. You had to pause and scroll to your weapon and press L1, still L1, and then it would play a little animation like the 3D object in your UI of the weapon would transform. I really wanted that because that also felt very authentic, right? Like the 3D object that's in your face is transforming, and then when you unpaused the game, it would be transformed.
Yeah, I feel like if we had like if a PlayStation 1 game had like transforming weapons the way Bloodborne has it would be one weapon, and it would be like the central gimmick of that entire game.
Right, and it would be like tied to like a charge attack or something. You know, it would. But yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, okay, so I'm also wondering, because of the visuals specifically, because Bloodborne is a really sort of gorgeous Gothic Victorian, like it takes place in this beautiful Gothic Victorian city, Yharnam. And what I find really interesting is that Bloodborne opens and it's kind of daytime. So like you have like this sort of baked orange sky. But in the Demake, it seems like the game just takes place at night at the start.
Mm-hmm. And that was a very conscious decision because Bloodborne, the game, has a... I don't even know if I can call it a mechanic, but just... Let's just call it a mechanic. This is easy way to describe it. Where the night progresses as you play through it. So at the start of the game, it's sunset. At the middle point of the game, it's nighttime, and near the end of the game, it's like spooky nightmare, super nighttime, right? Like the sky is purple and the moon is red or something. And the entirety of Central Yharnam in Bloodborne takes place at sunset. And Bloodborne PSX is Central Yharnam. So that would mean if I made it a 1-to-1, in terms of visuals, the entirety of Bloodborne PSX would not be at nighttime. And that just didn't work for me. So I made it start at nighttime, and then it went into deep nighttime and in the second half.
Yeah.
That's why I changed it. And also, in the early pre-release footage, I noticed there was changes back when it was called Project Beast, that Central Yharnam took place at nighttime, and I actually based a lot of the visuals on the Project Beast pre-release beta footage, because it just looked like it was more developed with the PlayStation 3 in mind instead of the PS4 if you like scrutinize it, and that felt a little more, it was a generation closer to the PS1, so I kind of used that as reference.
Yeah, totally. All right. It also just feels very like everybody knows about like Silent Hill used fog to obfuscate distances, but it also used darkness. A lot of games back then just used pitch darkness everywhere around you to get around having to design a lot of that. And it definitely feels a very sort of it's a very sort of PlayStation 1 mood. So out of this sort of preserving the authenticity of Bloodborne, what are some of the core essentials that you knew that whatever else I change, this must be preserved?
Good question. It would probably be the interconnected world. Bloodborne PSX is not a seamless interconnected world, but it was interconnected. It was, you would dip down to a loading screen during, in all the doorways. Mm-hmm. But it was a consistent world that you could map out in your head and navigate if you remember enough. And, you'd open up shortcuts, and the shortcuts would open up the level, and that would make you navigate the level differently. That was very important. I needed to preserve that. So I looked at Ocarina of Time as an example, because Ocarina of Time also has an interconnected world with loading screens, right? It'll dip to black and then fade back up when you walk up a stairway or open a door. Mm-hmm. But it is an interconnected world that you can navigate. And of course it has a map. That's a big difference. But you could navigate that world without it because it made logical sense. So that was something that absolutely had to be in Bloodborne PSX.
So yeah, you didn't design it like room by room. You designed the whole thing and then just chopped it up?
I did. I chopped it up first. Okay. And then I designed the individual rooms. The first room I made that wasn't a test room was the courtyard outside of Iosefka's clinic.
Okay.
That was the first room I made, and then it kind of naturally falls. Bloodborne kind of has a natural flow to it, where it's like, here's a room, you go through an archway. Here's a big, here's a medium-sized area. You go up a ladder. Here's another medium-sized area. You open a door, go through the door. Now you're inside, and inside this house, there's 3 doors, right? And like each one of those could be a loading screen. It kind of very easily segmented out into individual rooms, just because that's how Metroidvanias work, right? They kind of already have individual rooms. They're just seamless now.
Yeah. I noticed also, and I don't know if this was conscious, this was a conscious design decision, or if this is just something that comes naturally when you're rendering a world with simplistic geometric shapes. In contemporary games, you don't see a lot of sharp 90-degree turns, because years of playtesting has taught developers that players don't immediately, like, it's just not instinctual for a player to be looking straight ahead and then doing a 90-degree turn. So they have like 60, 70-degree turns be like the rule. You can't ask the player to look more than 70 degrees at any given change. But I did notice a lot of, and like I said, I don't know if this was a conscious or if this is just you're trying to make this whole thing work with these simplistic geometric shapes. I did notice a lot of those sorts of level layouts, which felt very authentic to the era.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that was conscious, but I believe what you said was correct. It wasn't conscious, but it did happen due to the simplistic nature of the level. And once you get those sharp turns in, you kind of have to rely on level design to draw people's eye to the correct place, which, in my opinion, is a lot easier when you make something at such a low resolution, because all the details are more sparse than in a high resolution game, and therefore all the details stand out more.
Totally. I'm a big fan of how you laid out the apartment Gilbert sits in, because in game, like in Bloodborne PlayStation 4, you can miss Gilbert. In Bloodborne Demake, it's just like a light that shoots out of the window. You're not missing that.
Right. I would. In playtesting, I did actually have a few people miss Gilbert.
Really?
So I probably could have been, yes, I probably could have been even more overt, but it does stand out definitely more than Bloodborne PS4, just by nature of there being less detail, so the details that do exist stick out more.
Totally. How long did the development of the game take?
13 months.
13 months. And did you like map out all of the production and be like, okay, I'm gonna design the core game, design the maps, and then incorporate them and then just polish until it works? Or how does that work?
I don't... I didn't have like some big like production schedule.
Okay.
But I did want to make it. I did want to make it within the year. I wanted it to be within 12 months. I did delay it internally to 13. But because of the 12-month restriction I set on myself, I did make a lot of cuts to stay on track. But it was kind of figured out as I went. I'm not much of the kind of developer who makes a massive design document and sticks to it. I kind of do a more find the fun type of approach.
Oh, yeah.
And it is making a demake instead of a original game is significantly easier on that part, because I guess you do have the ultimate design document, which is just the game being made already as a reference. So that did make things significantly easier. I won't deny that. But I did have to, I had a prediction on what I could make, which was originally Central Yarnum and the Cathedral Ward. It was originally going to end with Vicar Amelia, and I cut it in half because I forget who said this, who this quote is attributed to, but when it comes to game development, it is said that you should take your predictions for a time on how long it'll take and double it. And that's how long your game will actually take to make. But I restricted myself to 12 months, so instead of doubling the development time, I just cut the game in half. And that was pretty accurate. It took me 13 months instead of 12, but it was accurate.
All right.
It was mostly accurate.
I've also heard this saying about doubling your time, and I also can't remember where I picked it up.
Right. I think one of my producers said it back when I was industry, but...
Yeah. It's probably just some like common industry knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious now about Bloodborne Kart. Name not necessarily withstanding. So you talked about having it's kind of made easier doing the demake because you have the PlayStation 4 version of Bloodborne already existing. But so it like if ever you were like, I need to regain focus, I'm getting a bit lost in the weeds here, you always have the original game to sort of anchor you back to something. But how does the lack of a definitive model for Bloodborne Kart change the way you go about designing?
It made it more difficult. Very much straight up just more difficult to design for a couple of reasons, but one of them was I just didn't have a game to look at and, for lack of a better term, copy. I couldn't copy anyone's homework, and that made it difficult. Bloodborne Kart, Nightmare Kart's original development, outside of, this legally mandated delay was, I believe, like over 20 months for sure, which was a lot longer than Bloodborne PSX. And I think that was one of the main reasons why. A couple of the other reasons was just I never made a kart racer or a driving game of any type before. So that was just, I just made things more difficult. And AI was also had to be a lot more sophisticated. Because Souls games have very, very simple AI. They kind of just run up to you and play their animations. And, the animations, of course, are intricate and best in the biz. But the actual mechanical AI is very simple. Most of the fun combat comes from the extremely polished animation. But for a kart racer, they're going to have to actually drive. You can't fake that with animation. So that and AI is definitely my weakest suit when it comes to game development. That is the weakest hat that I have to wear as a solo developer. So that also like slowed things down considerably.
Yeah, I'm in the same boat. I hate AI.
AI, the video game mechanical thing, not the generative
Yeah.
garbage you see on the internet right now.
Same. I was so like, I had such a big boner for generative AI in like the first week. I was like, oh my god, I'm doing all these fake Bloodborne 2 promos. But then,
oh yeah, back when none of us even knew, back when it didn't even like look correct. It just looked like
it was just like this interesting novelty. But now it's just like, oh my god, like I can't go on Twitter without seeing this shit like 50 times. Come on, give me a break.
Yeah, I can't even Google references anymore.
Yeah. So are there any specific, like, are you a kart racing fan in general? Or?
I used to be. I have a lot of fond memories of Mario Kart 64 specifically. And not really a kart racer, but I really enjoyed MotorStorm on the PlayStation 3. There was like a trilogy of MotorStorm games. I played all of them, and those were really fun. Very, it wasn't a kart racer, but it was still very arcadey, very chaotic. It all, it felt like, kids crashing their toy cars together. That's what MotorStorm felt like, and that really appealed to me. So I did really enjoy that game and Mario Kart 64. I would say both of those were my two big like racing games that I was into.
Yeah. So would you like? Are you still looking at those as like references, or is the Nightmare Kart, is that more of a sort of an iterative? You're discovering what it is as you design it.
A little bit of both. The core systems were mostly just inspired by Mario Kart 64, but the whole appeal of Bloodborne Kart was that it was Bloodborne, and I wanted to reference that on a mechanical level. Kind of like how Smash Brothers references their fighters on a mechanical level. Like, if you palette swap fighters, it would still, like, if you changed Link in Smash Brothers into a generic character, you would still know that they were Link based on their mechanics. Or if, you replaced, like what was it, like Minecraft Steve, right? Like, it would still, just because of the mechanics of the fighter, it still felt like it was from their game, which is something similar I did with Bloodborne Kart or Nightmare Kart, right? Like, you had to kill enemies to get blood echoes to increase your max speed, which wasn't exactly the same, but you were killing enemies to get better, right? To improve your stats,
sort of,
which was
it's kind of
same
like the
kind of
rallying mechanic, kind of.
Right. So that was, I wanted to do as much of that as possible.
I really loved following the sort of releases of which writers were going to be in the game and which weren't. And it really bothers me that you can't use the Bloodborne name, because I thought it would be really funny if Alfred was able to write Martyr Logarius because he's such a dick writer. And now...
Oh, it was actually... the original, it was going to be his wheel. His weapon was a wheel, so that kind of made itself. Yeah, that was going to be the idea. It was originally going to be a post-launch thing. Obviously, not anymore. But yeah, it was difficult selecting the roster because I obviously couldn't do every character. But I think I got most of the you have to do this character type of character. So.
And I'm sure there's still people that are like, well, I can't believe you didn't use this character. It's like, well...
Right. Well, yeah, no matter what I do, I'm going to disappoint somebody. Yeah. So, but I'm happy with... I was happy with the roster.
Why isn't Gilbert there? He can write his room. How does the setting itself sort of lend itself to the kart racer format? Because obviously it's like, we talked about this earlier, it's like a Victorian Gothic city.
Right.
I can't imagine that a kart track is easy to just implement into that environment.
It actually might be easier than you might initially think, because Yharnam is a city with streets. So they're just streets that are covered in garbage and like destruction. But if clean up the streets, so to speak, you do have streets that make sense. Like you have a road, you have a sidewalk, you have buildings on either side, and you have some obstacles like a rundown carriage or whatever that you gotta zoom around. So it actually did kind of work. It kind of worked out in terms of track design and like keeping the aesthetic consistent. Obviously, it's way more clean than Bloodborne, even Bloodborne PSX, but that's just for the sake of gameplay. So it does look a little bit different, but I do want to say I at least captured the vibe a little bit.
All right, right on. So I have some more random questions, and then maybe we can jump back back and forth through the games. So your playtesting method is, do you like bring in outsiders? Do you bring in friends? Do you just personally go through all of it and vibe it out?
I go through all of it. I playtest as I develop. So that's kind of the first step. Next step, yeah, it's just like friends and my roommates. I'll just sit them down, they'll play, and I'll, take notes.
And is that,
and then, go ahead.
Is that during development, or is that more just like once you've sort of settled on how you want it to be, you just want to gauge their opinion on like how intuitive it is, or?
Definitely during development.
Okay.
Yeah, if I just need help. Or one example was pressing L1 and left or right to drift. And there was a couple, again, that was just what it was, but there were a couple people who pressed left or right first and then pressed L1 a couple frames after, and that didn't register because the order of operations was incorrect. And I just never did that because my brain is wired differently. But when they were playing the game, they had a miserable experience because drifting didn't work for them. So it's really good to even just just to have like 2 or 3 people just sit down and play your game just for a little bit. You can get a lot of obvious bugs, fixes that you never would have run into because of your own play style for your own game. So it's, definitely had a few people jump in. And then, once the game is like, I guess you'd say like in beta stage, right? When all the assets are in and the story's in, and you're mostly just bug fixing. That's kind of when I reach out to still friends, but like online friends, right? And I'll like send them builds and they'll test it and get back to me.
How does it work when you have a game like the Bloodborne Demake, which is deliberately trying to sort of evoke a more clunky, antiquated style of game design? It must be a bit of a puzzle piecing together how to integrate the sort of feedback you get.
Right. When it comes to feedback, it's definitely... This sounds awful, but like you don't listen to the feedback. You don't listen to the words. You look at why they said those words.
Yeah.
If that makes any sense at all. Like, here's one where it's just like a person could come back and be like, yeah, I wish there was like a mechanic that lets you grab an edge if you fall off, because I just think that would be a better way for this game, and that would be way too much work for me to do. So I look at the recorded footage, and there was a big enemy who would hit them, and it would knock them backwards by 10 feet. They'd fall off a cliff, right? And that led them to saying, I wish there was a ledge grab mechanic. But what they were actually, like the actual issue was this enemy kept knocking them off a cliff. So you'd put fences up, or make the knockback half the distance, or whatever, and that would address the issue, even though you completely ignored the feedback. So it was that mostly addressed a lot of the feedback I got. That was kind of like, this felt like a PS1 game.
I really like that. I like that mindset. You've played Shadow of the Colossus, right?
Oh, absolutely.
So are you familiar with the pillar dangling over Mono conversation that happened?
Yeah, so you couldn't like jump on her or something?
Yeah, I love that. It's just
right, yeah.
We have to preserve the tranquility of the scene and make sure the player doesn't sabotage it. How do we do it? oh, we just make it so that they intuitively understand that they can't even try to jump on the character.
Right. As opposed to like, you know, making that part of the world like a forced walking section or something, right? They changed the design of the environment to accommodate the controls.
Totally. And I love that. And I love that with the idea of reducing the knockback, where it's such... like you're getting around the problem ahead of the player even being able to get to the problem. So you're kind of like thinking, you're just kind of outthinking the player.
You could look at it that way for sure.
They also, I think they also shaved Trico's crotch in The Last Guardian for the same reason, so that the player just instinctively gets that, oh, I can't climb that, because that would be weird. He has a shaved
that makes sense.
His crotch. I checked.
Yeah, that makes sense.
What's your favorite component of game design?
Ooh, good question. Oh gosh, probably the prototyping stage. I feel like that's a very obvious answer that everyone would say, but just when you don't have to worry about polish and it's just pure creation and you're just throwing things at the wall and leaning into one thing and, you know, completely abandoning the original idea because whatever you just found while prototyping is way better. That's the best part, in my opinion. And it's just you're just iterating so quickly because you're not even worrying about like, well, if I change this, it'll break that. Like, who cares? It's a prototype, totally. You know.
And you have like the final prototype ends up being like 12 different prototypes, all sort of Frankenstein together into one monster.
I actually have the original prototype for Bloodborne PSX. I was able to dig up the executable. It's on the itch.io if you want to download it. And
I gotta check it out.
Yeah, it's completely different code. I did not iterate off of the prototype. I threw it out and started over. But it's kind of interesting seeing what made it into the final game and what didn't. One of the big ones was manual aiming by holding down the gun button. That felt very like PS1. That was in the prototype. And then something that absolutely did not make it into the final game was the idea that charging your weapon would be what transformed it instead of making it a menu option. So like when you held it down, it would transform and then they'd do their big attack. And that was just an idea I was prototyping and I didn't like it. So I changed it to be a button prompt in the pause menu.
Oh yeah. The aiming to shoot, that definitely feels like something that they would have done in a PlayStation 1 game, but at the same time, the guns are so, like, that's not the function of guns in Bloodborne, so it would have felt probably weird if that had been integrated.
Right.
Yeah. I'm really interested in this whole dance of, well, you know, you're making a new game, but you're basing it on this other game, and you're trying to make it in the style of an even older game, and it's like, it's such an interesting sort of dynamic to have to vibe your way through.
Right. There was a lot of there was a lot of things pulling me in a bunch of different directions, and it was interesting trying to get something somewhat in the middle of everything. Yeah.
I'm a big fan of, you added a little sort of sewer sequence where you're. I already complimented you on your platforming beam sequence. You also had one in the beginning of the game, but I'm a big fan of the one you added with what was it, like purple sewage water or something?
Yeah, the poison sewers, the poison swamp.
The poison swamp
for the meme. Yeah, that was. All the extensions for the game outside of the last one, Gilbert's Mansion, was for actual like gameplay reasons, like walking along the beams in the clinic at the start. I did that because I needed to teach players the new key system because I rewrote how keys worked and made it way more clunky. Yeah. So I basically had to lock the player into a room and force them to figure out how the keys worked. So I made the second story to the clinic, which was original, which meant I could put a key up there and teach players how the keys worked. Right. So that was why I extended it there. And then for the sewers, I believe they were called the aqueducts in Bloodborne PS4, right? And the aqueducts were like less than 1% of the Bloodborne game world, right? Like it was super small. Bloodborne is very good at having super varied environmental design. It feels like every 5 minutes you're in a different area with a different vibe. And but it could go ahead.
Yeah, I was just gonna say it is probably the most urban fantasy game ever made. Like 99% of the game takes place in this cobbled city, but every area is still somehow amazingly distinct. It's incredible.
Right. It's great. I love it. But making a bunch of unique assets for what would be 3 rooms in a PS1 game, it wasn't really worth the development time. So I extended, so like you were in the sewers, air quotes, for a few minutes. So I wanted to extend that because I built all these sewer assets and I built an entire like ankle deep water system that would only have been used for 3 rooms. So I wanted to extend that. And I also built the poison system and it wasn't really used anywhere. So I was like, okay, poison sewer. Sure. I just took the things I needed to do or I wanted to do and mashed them together. And that's kind of how the poison sewer came to be. And also I just needed more keys in the game. The game only had 1 key, the first floor clinic key, and the sewer key, and I needed more. So there was that, and then there was the basement, which required the basement key, and then Gilbert's Mansion had 2 keys specifically, so I could just have more keys, because I just needed more keys, because I wrote this whole key system, and then never used it.
And you're like, I went through the trouble of creating this really clunky system. I'm gonna get the mileage out of it. I'm gonna make them use it.
Right, and that felt very PlayStation 1, Yeah. PlayStation 1, like a lot of games nowadays might have like vestigial mechanics or mechanics that are barely used, but you couldn't really afford to do that back on the PlayStation 1 because games were so small.
Yeah.
So you really had to get your money's worth, time, gameplay time worth out of every mechanic and every function that you built.
Totally. You're not adding this
and that led to
the game. Sorry. Yeah, sorry. You're not adding this to the game unless it's going to be used a lot.
Right, and that led to probably my favorite part of the game, maybe, second favorite, maybe, which was using the clunky key system to my advantage, which was when you're trapped with your back to a locked door and the Winter Lantern is approaching and you have to fumble with your keys to get the gate open. That's probably my favorite part of the game. It was executed like every Let's Play I watch, everyone walks up to that door and it's locked and they have to go like, oh shit, and they pause the game and they're fumbling through the terrible UI that's all clunky, and they hear the singing getting closer and they're freaking out. Like I think that was the best executed part of the game that just was executed exactly how I imagined it in my head.
I love that sort of sequence. I hate that because so many of these sorts of functions in contemporary games are sort of context sensitive, so you don't really go through your keys.
They streamlined it all away.
Yeah, and I feel like we lose so many of those sorts of interesting moments when it's all handled like that.
Right, I agree. That was a big part of Bloodborne PSX, was bringing the rough edges back, because when you sandal the edges away, it's just you lose stuff.
Yeah,
I think you lose stuff when you remove the clunky keys. I don't know. I think that was a good example of that, was like trapped and you have to fumble with your keys while an enemy slowly walks towards you. Like I would feel like nowadays that would just be a contextual animation where you have to like mash A or whatever, which doesn't really hit the same.
You have to button mash A to open door.
Button mash A so the character can fumble with their keys, and it's like a scripted thing, I don't know.
and your annoying sidekick is yammering at you the whole time. Oh lordy. Yeah, but it's also those sorts of weird mechanics, those sorts of edges, like you talked about it, they give so many added avenues for developer expression, where when you give one developer these tools, you're going to get a very different sequence from one you get if you give this other developer. Whereas when it's all streamlined, it's just, it loses so much of its personality.
I agree. I totally agree.
All right, then. Do you think there's something special about the PlayStation 1 style, since you've now made a couple of games on it?
Yeah, I would absolutely say that. PlayStation 1 specifically, because of all of the corners that were cut to get the thing to even work. Like how the textures. I don't remember all the technical terms, but like I think it's called affine texture warping or whatever. The graphics look like they're melting, right? Yeah, and that is unique. Yeah, that is unique to PlayStation 1, mostly unique. And that was seen as inferior, but now it's the most iconic part of PS1 games, right? As time goes on, the biggest criticisms of a console's generation or any type of art is looked back on the most fondly.
Totally. That's why we people act like pixel art was always like so universally loved. I distinctly remember people complaining about.
I agree. Yeah, no, absolutely. I remember too.
So yeah, it's that's a really good observation you made. And I love those sort of wibbly wobbly PlayStation 1 textures, specifically in games like Bloodborne, where there is a lot of blood and gore. I love it in the first Resident Evil, because like when you shoot a zombie's head, you get that sort of texture of the blood, and because it's so wibbly and wobbly, it feels so chunky, and it feels like it's kind of writhing at the same time. It's really, really good for horror. The opening to Silent Hill 1.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Or just any environment in Silent Hill 1 really, just really benefits from that.
That was something I used to my advantage for the Winter Lantern encounter in Bloodborne PSX. I messed with the scale for all the limbs, especially like the tentacle limbs. I made them oscillate between big and small to kind of make it look even more melty and wobbly and gross. And it really made it really scary, in my opinion. Just seeing this weird blob of flesh and eyeballs, just you can't even fully make it out because it's so gross and squishy.
Yeah. And it's also the effect where, because there's so many details missing, but because it is clearly something, your brain just starts going wild trying to map what is this? What am I looking at?
Quantify it, right.
Yeah. Yeah. All right then. Were there any interesting anecdotes that come to mind from the development of these games?
What do you mean exactly?
Not really fishing for anything in particular. It's more just so, for example, when I was working on a game that it was called Tom's Troubles, and this game never came out. It was lost in the great my laptop crash of 2019. But
oh no!
Yeah, but the whole concept of the game was that it's just like a little Zelda game, except every mechanic had to relate to you being a little troublemaking boy, and
gotcha.
I had gotten it to a point where I needed, the player can't even run without without getting into trouble and running away from it. So you were I spent a week just walking the streets of my city and figuring out how, if I was a little boy, how would I get in trouble here? How would I get in trouble here? And I had little sequences, you can go into a little soccer match and you can steal the ball and be chased by all of the players, or you can go into people's yards and anger the dogs, and then you can run. So I'm just something not necessarily that specifically, but if there's anything interesting stories during development.
Interesting stories during development, yeah. There was... This was very... Okay, yeah, here's a few stories. In Bloodborne PS4, your second encounter with the werewolves on the bridge, I feel like a lot of people cheese it in that one doorway. And I certainly did. I know a lot of people like cheesed it. You run past them, you run into the house, the dark house, and turn around and they're stuck in the doorway and you cheese in there.
Yeah.
And I remember during the prototyping stage, I don't think this is in the prototype that I like uploaded, but in the prototyping stage, I had the werewolves. Those were the first enemy, and I was testing them out. And then, I was done testing, but they were still in the game world. So then I was testing doors, and I tested the door, and I walked to the door, and I turned around, and the werewolf was stuck in the doorway, and I cheesed it in the doorway, and I just happened upon that purely by coincidence, exactly how a lot of people cheesed the same werewolf by keeping them in the doorway. And I remember for Bloodborne PSX, because I wanted to keep that, I wanted to have people cheese the werewolves in the doorway, but you couldn't because the doorway was a loading screen. So what I did was add a second doorway before the cheese doorway that wasn't a loading screen, so you could properly cheese them the same way you would on the PS4 version. And I put a lot of effort into make sure that was preserved properly. And another interesting glitch that is still in the game, but to a much lesser extent, was I accidentally stumbled upon Infinite Sword glitch, which is something that Ocarina of Time is very widely known to have. It's one of the most fundamental glitches for Ocarina of Time. If you are aware of like the speedrunning and like glitch community for that game. And effectively how it works is when your sword is active, it will check every frame or every multiple times a second if your sword is hitting anything, and if it does, do damage. And then when the swing is over, it will stop that. So what you do is trigger a glitch that will prevent it from stopping the check. So your sword is just doing damage at all the time. Like you're running around and run up to an enemy and your sword will touch it and it will deal damage. And I had that exact same glitch happen for Bloodborne PSX. And that was just really nostalgic. No matter how far forward we are in time, we do keep coming back to that fundamental game that defined how every 3D game played.
No matter
that's just
no matter what we try, Miyamoto did it first. Were there any mechanics or changes you thought would make for an interesting shakeup, but didn't include for the sake of authenticity?
Oh, that's a good question. Yes, I guess not for the sake of authenticity, but more just cut for time. But
okay,
I basically I wanted to make a new weapon called the Hunter's Gauntlets, which are just like big punchy fists that you would like spark to put them on fire. And that idea came around because I made the entire animation set for Unarmed, right? Because Unarmed is technically a weapon.
Oh yeah.
And it's got an entire moveset that no one will ever see because no one will ever use it. And I was like, I
tried fighting the werewolf at the start.
Yeah, okay, yes. After the first werewolf, it's true. But yeah, after the first werewolf, no one ever fully appreciates it and uses it. So I in the spirit of I want to take these mechanics that I built and get as much mileage out of them as I could, because it's a PS1 game. So I wanted to make basically a weapon that used the unarmed moveset. So I could get my money's worth, my effort's worth out of those animations. So I came up with the idea of the Hunter's Gauntlets, which are just big fists and you punched. And you pressed and you could spark it kind of like the Tonitrus, but fire, right? So I guess like the Boom Hammer, which I think was a DLC weapon. But yeah, that was... And I cut that, I cut it for time, but I probably would have cut it anyways for authenticity's sake, maybe. Who knows, in this hypothetical world where I had time to make it, what I would have done, but that's the first thing that comes to mind.
Yeah. I like that. Bloodborne had like the Fists of Gracia. Was that the only sort of
yes, that was a left-handed weapon, so it didn't have a full moveset. It had a single animation, but it did have that. It's true.
And I guess like the pile driver or the stake driver would be like the closest we have to
right
to something on the right. But yeah, I like that. I think that's a cool weapon.
Maybe someday in the future it'll show up in one of my future indie games. Who knows?
DLC sequel. This might be an interesting final question. Is there any specific component of the PlayStation 1 style you feel helps bring something out of Bloodborne that the PlayStation 4 was missing?
Yes. I could point to a lot of things, but probably the most prominent thing is the distance fog. Fading the game world to pitch black makes the game way more scary.
Yeah.
And that just... I wasn't even really trying to make Bloodborne more scary. Not at the start. Obviously, like, I realized it just became more scary partway through and leaned into that. But, like, at the start, I was just kind of just like, all right, here's Bloodborne, and it's PS1, and, like, I'm going to make it nighttime because I think that's more authentic to, like, Bloodborne as a whole, right? And I'm going to make the monsters all lo-fi, and I'm going to make it, you know, the draw distance really short. And everyone who played it was like, this is terrifying. This is way more scary than Bloodborne PS4. And I was like, oh, let me lean into that, right? And then I made the Nemesis, the Winter Lantern. I turned them into a Nemesis style enemy, right? And like that was kind of intentionally supposed to be scary. But at the start, I just made it scarier on accident because that's just how PS1 games work.
Yeah. The PlayStation 1 was probably the best console for horror.
I agree.
And not even just like it had good horror games, but like the actual nuts and bolts of how the PlayStation 1 renders games just really works for horror.
It really did. I think, once again, I forget who said this, but low poly is very much like the VHS of video games.
Oh, yes.
Right? Like a shitty, messed up VHS just makes things more terrifying. Just by nature of it being an old VHS tape. You don't even need to do anything. It just makes it scarier just because that's how it works. And I think that's true for like low poly, or I guess lo-fi, you know, low fidelity in general for video games. Really, it just makes things scary.
Yeah. And like it's so weird because the presentation style is obviously so connected to this very specific era that everybody sort of can remember what it used to be like, but there's also just something innately spooky about it because you have these simplistic shapes that are sort of being contorted into the shape of real human beings, and it's just like it has some
uncanny.
Yeah, it's uncanny.
It's just naturally uncanny by nature of it being low poly, low fidelity.
Yeah. I think that's it then. I'm going to just rack up my brain, see if I can. Unless you have like anything special you want to like elaborate on, want to talk more about. I don't want to take up too much of your time, of course.
Yeah. Nothing's jumping out to me. Yeah. I guess that's it.
Guess that's it. Awesome. Do you want to tell the people where they can find you?
Sure, yeah. You can find me on Twitter at Botster with a 0, B0TSTR.
You mean X?
No, I mean Twitter! But yeah, at Botster with a 0. That's basically where you can find me anywhere on all social medias and on itch.io and YouTube and all that stuff. If you want to find me, you can type that in and you'll find me right there.
I'll have a little tab in the description where I'll have all of those links available for people.
Great.
Thank you so much for recording this talk with me. Thank you so much for making these games. They're awesome. And
glad to hear it.
And thanks everybody for listening or watching, wherever you are. Okay, Christmas Carol ending here. But yeah, thanks everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.